Chris Bedford. He's the senior politics editor and D.C. correspondent for TheBlaze. Chris, good to have you back with us, sir.
It's great to be here, Vince.
Okay, so yes, they're overseas, some of them are, but you do think that Republicans did have a decent week in the Congress. Tell us why.
You know, and to your point, I feel so strange being introduced this way. And I got a text this morning from a longtime McCarthy aide in response to my newsletter that said that's a particularly rosy newsletter from Chris Bedford. He didn't think he usually read much happy news from me, but you know, I actually think that it was a good week. And you know, there's always, of course, the confirmations, which are moving actually at a great clip, except for Kash Patel, who got pushed aside. So congressmen and senators particularly could go play field trip in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
But Monday morning at sunrise, there was not a single budget proposal out there. Everybody kept on arguing about the rules. I reminded me of a bunch of school kids just saying, well, spending the whole of recess talking about what the rules of the game would be. And then the Freedom Caucus Monday afternoon just kicks the ball and said, you know what, we're doing it. We're starting the game right now. Enough with this stuff. Recess is almost over. We're coming up against the deadline. And they shot it out. Rebecca Zelko at TheBlaze reported that out. And after that, there was a flurry of activity. You saw Speaker Johnson that night talking to reporters over at Punchbowl and Politico saying, we've got something that's going to be out very soon. And by early Wednesday morning, they had a budget put together, at least for a first draft from House leadership. And then we saw this strange thing, which we never actually get to see anymore, actually legislating and arguing and debating. And yesterday's 12-hour budget committee hearing, where they worked through the different amendments, and they ended up negotiating. And you ended up with agreement between the Freedom Caucus and House leadership, not yet the liberal Republicans, now they get to hold the grenade, on a budget that had 7 times the budget cuts that the original ideas that came out of that Miami conference had actually produced. One that had Mike Johnson and Chip Roy nodding in agreement. One that, when I was talking to Hill staffers yesterday, there was like a moment of calm and peace, saying, well, you know, we're allowed to talk to each other again. We're actually making some movement. People are finally, well, not, of course, much could go wrong. Much probably will go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
People are finally working together. And they're finally talking, and they're making moves, and they're marking up bills. And, of course, as soon as that happens, it's going to go to recess, and that some of that momentum will be lost. But this was actually the hardest step, was the first step of trying to actually put numbers down on paper. Because previously, you had leadership looking at the conservatives saying, well, how much cuts do you guys need? And you had conservatives looking back, well, how much are you going to spend? Because that makes it that's what makes a big difference. Now there are finally numbers on the table, people able to look forward, and from there you can negotiate until you get to a deal. That was an important process. And then at the same time, you had another Democrat, one you've almost certainly never heard of. She was just someone who's just been a placeholder. Her most famous thing having to do with the seat that she replaced Al Franken, saying that she's not going to run for re-election. And that makes a map that was already starting to look bad for Democrats look worse and look even harder for them to defend and more expensive for them to defend. So at the end of the week, you look at the confirmations, you look at the budget, you look at the Democrats faltering, and it seems like the wins that are coming out of the White House are starting to even trickle to Capitol Hill.
Yeah. You know, as this is the president's high water mark for political capital. Anything he wants to do big, he has to do now, at least traditionally. And so it's helpful. It's heartening that Republicans in Congress are working together at this critical moment for the Trump presidency. What explains that? Why do you think that they're collaborating in an unusual way? Why is Chris Bedford finally writing a rosy newsletter?
Well, I think the conservatives are feeling like they've got the wind at their back. The agenda is really clearly set. You know, in 2017, what MAGA was not particularly clearly set, except for border security, tariffs, which the White House could handle, the wall funding, which was difficult. Those are some of the main things about MAGA then. Now he's got a very specific ask. You have Stephen Miller and James Braid over there in legislative affairs coming down and saying these are the president's asks. These are what we need. Also, no tax on tips would be good. This is the direction. And the Trump tax cuts have already been legislated. Now you just need to make them permanent. We don't need any more negotiations on those. Clear set marching orders, wind at the back of conservatives, And at the same time, I mean, the only thing that can really explain the collapse of McConnell's neoconservative opposition in the Senate, where it still lives on, where it's still stronger than any other part of the actual real world, is that Trump's polling at 53%. I mean, even Doge is polling between 52 and 55% over the few outliers. Elon Musk, the same. The president's extremely popular. And it turns out that he's not just an aberration who's here for 4 years and then gone.
Yeah.
He's not only here to stay, but he's actually got a retinue with him now. He's got a court. He's got people who will continue this afterwards. He's got, for the first time, mega donors with Elon Musk who are explicitly willing to put money into primaries. That's something that did not exist before. It was all small money grassroots.
Good point.
All of these things combine into a fear from the people who would want to oppose it. I mean, even today, you had a liberal Republican, I think it was in Pennsylvania, he's got 1,000 Twitter followers, he's a new member of Congress, coming out saying, I can't support these cuts to the budget. Well, let's see if there's tune changes, because the people who elected him by 2 points, and his district went to Trump by 8 points. So clearly they actually voted for the president's agenda.
Yes.
And that's the sort of thing that's going to be difficult to actually stand up. You can send out a tough tweet.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the president's going to come in and be able to push this over.
How much, I do wonder to what extent President Trump is either working behind the scenes or the efforts he's undertaking in public to kind of whip all these guys into line. Because I look at people like Joni Ernst, who originally came out and signaled her intentions against Pete Hegseth, and then the conservatives really lit into her to the point that she was very obedient by the end of it, and thank goodness. Senator Tom Tillis is another example who looked like he was on the verge of attempting to upend Pete Hegseth's nomination, and he too fell into line. To what extent is kind of the collective conservative pressure campaign having a positive effect?
That's had a huge positive effect. First of all, they're making Ernst, who was one of McConnell's favorite allies, a whipping boy. Some a whipping girl, I suppose, in this case. Someone who was made an example of in front of a lot of people and who was attacked, and there was a clear willingness to go after her that was seemingly, for some reason, whatever reason, very unexpected by her. And then you've got Tillis. He's the Republican incumbent who's absolutely in most danger for his reelection next year in a state that Donald Trump dominated. So at the end of the day, he's got to argue against his brain, which has not been that impressive, honestly, in the speeches and the concessions he's been demanding. Somewhere in his brain, he's got to say, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Maybe I shouldn't cross a president who's significantly more popular than me in my state, who's got the backing of someone who can take out a primary against me, who will come after me if I try to sink him. Sometimes, there's a carrot and a stick, and you got to give the rewards. And Trump's actually always been good about that. He'll take someone who was an enemy of his for a long time, and if they say nice things and come on board, he'll occasionally make these jokes like, you used to not like me, but now you like me, right? Now you like me.
Mm-hmm.
And they become friends, and he'll become a political ally, sometimes to the annoyance of the hardcore guys like Steve Bannon saying, why are you being pals with them? Now they said all these things back in the past, but he's always willing to bring people back into the fold. And I think that's the social media campaign, the MAGA being united, the getting hit from the top, getting hit from the bottom. And J.D. Vance, in particular, has been very active at 1 a.m. meetings, at 2 a.m. meetings, bringing these people in, dealing with them, and getting things across the finish line.
Actually, I want to expand on that for a moment because I think that's great. But before I get there, you do remind me though that Trump does like bringing people back into the fold who were against him, but then occasionally reminding them. I'm reminded of that old Against Trump cover, National Review 2016. Where you had, if you want to chuckle, just go back and look at who signed that cover. That cover has all sorts of names on it, and most of those people, if not all of them, came around to Trump and said, actually, he's right. He was good, and I was wrong. But Trump, he does, when he sees those guys, occasionally be like, you used to be against me. You're not anymore.
You and I saw it in person, Vince, with one of those signers sitting there at a table, and he looked at her and said, huh? You like me now. You didn't used to. You didn't used to. But now you do.
It's funny.
And it was just kind of an awkward smile. Let's kiss the ring.
It's the best. It's so funny to me. Okay, so JD Vance is fresh out of the United States Senate. He's now part of the White House. He's done some tie-breaking votes when necessary. I guess the question is, I keep hearing rumors that he really is working aggressively to advance all of these nominees in the Senate. What is the role that he's playing?
So if you look at as soon as J.D. Vance came to Capitol Hill, it was very clear he was not going to be a Tina Smith, that Congress senator who just resigned. He was going to be someone who was known, and sometimes that led to fights. He had a rather public spat with Senator Ted Cruz, who, of course, felt like, I'm the senior guy. I've been here forever. Who are you to be fighting with me over this train bill in public? He was willing to have sharp elbows, and he was also working really hard. His staff were working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. You can ask their wives and husbands about how difficult it was to keep the families going and the kids all going to school with the work schedules these guys were doing.
Yeah.
And he not only has brought all of those staff with him, either to the White House or the vice presidency, but he's maintained that kind of frenetic schedule and that real just work ethic. I guess the work ethic that got him from a kid, if you read one of the millions who've read his biography, from Appalachia to the elite schools to the vice presidency with a stop off making money in business and writing a best-selling book. That's a work ethic. These aren't ghost-written. This is real ambition on behalf of the vice president, and at the same time willing to go into talk to the New York Times and talk to senators and forge these deals.
Yes. As
someone who's got trust and someone who's got an understanding of the legislative process because he's been learning it.
Yes.
And we see that today in Munich, his willingness to go in and speak truth to people, but at the same time also offer negotiations. You saw someone who's been a vociferous opponent of the Ukraine war. I think the most eloquent opponent of the Ukraine war that we have in the United States, saying we'll put troops on the ground if we need to, because that's part of negotiation. That's a willingness to go outside of his comfort zone to try to make sure people come to the table. He's a generational political talent. And to see Donald Trump, who's an epoch-defining political talent, with J.D. Vance in the same White House is a formidable team.
Yeah, it's amazing. He's got J.D. Vance has a great skill set and complements Trump really well. So Mitch McConnell, you mentioned before that he still has some power in the United States Senate. He's still in the United States Senate. But one of the things I've noticed is this week and in the past few weeks, he's like, in some cases, the only holdout who's voting against President Trump's nominees. And he's doing it theatrically. He's releasing whiny statements about why he can't support Tulsi Gabbard, that kind of thing. But I'm curious if you are detecting any sort of meaningful difference between McConnell and John Thune, who now runs the Senate. Because I was thinking today that, I know for a fact that if McConnell were still the leader, that it wouldn't be better right now. The situation would not be better. It would quite possibly be a lot worse. But at best, it would be completely even. How do you think John Thune is doing?
And, I've seen McConnell's power really wane faster than I expected, because I think he spent his capital on someone who was so good at making other people do his bidding for him, now has to do it himself. And it's just an old man throwing two middle fingers in the air and giving a protest vote. Someone who ought to have retired, and he's losing relevancy. He's losing power because of it. But he always had the attitude that, he came in when Reagan was president. He's been around a long time. He became into leadership when George W. Bush was president. He's defined really by those years. Donald Trump to him is an usurper, someone who does not belong in Washington, someone who he must protect his foreign policy and his ideas in Washington from. So he has a very different attitude about this from John Thune. Now, John Thune came up under McConnell, was a close ally of McConnell, shares a lot of staff with McConnell, often deferred to McConnell on matters of policy, on fundraising, on suggestions. But he's someone who understands, therefore, by the grace of Trump, essentially, politically, go I. And he needs to be close with this president. He's been shown a complete and total willingness to work on the president for his agenda, get it across. He's shown that. He's shown that in the way he's pushed the budget so far, the way he's trying to solidify the gains that DOGE has made and changes the federal government. He's been a loyal friend of Donald Trump, and he kind of represents I wouldn't say someone like J.D. Vance, who came to the U.S. Senate looking to change things with a populist nationalist agenda, but just as good as a principled conservative as an unprincipled politician, someone who's willing to just work with who's in charge to get things done. And I think Thune has happily surprised me thus far. Of course, these are glory days. You don't really know who your friends and your enemies are until it starts to get a little darker out.
No, that's true. And there are certain politicians who are entirely loyal to the alpha, whoever it is in their life. And so maybe Thune was doing that with McConnell. Now that McConnell's not the guy anymore, Trump definitely is. And also, one other thing to remember about Trump's relationship with Thune, Trump sat out the Senate leadership race, and that was to Thune's benefit. Trump just decided, he said, I'll let you guys handle it. He didn't have to do that. He could have come out and said, that he would support Rick Scott. He was endorsing him. Everyone else should get out of the way. He didn't do that. Thune's there thanks to Donald Trump, and he would do well to remember that. He probably does.
He does, and that was a wise fight for Trump to sit out, because when you can't hold people accountable because you've got a secret vote, well, then that's how you end up getting an accidental loss. And then that aura of invincibility, it gets fierce.
Yeah, no, big time. All right, hey, as always, the great Chris Bedford with finally a rosy newsletter in TheBlaze. You can get it every day. Thanks, Chris. Good to talk to you, sir.